Hello, global gardeners, and welcome to the last show of autumn before the seasons change. Looks like it's going to be a crazy week of cold weather for many of us in the US and Canada. And so, with the seasonal change and the changing weather, I thought it might be kind of fun to talk about solstices today, the winter solstice and the summer solstice. So, that'll be our primary focus. Let's give a shout out to Christy Grows in Cambridgeshire. Love that part of the country. It's been decades since I've toured Cambridge. The Ely Cathedral is just incredible. If you're ever in that part of the country, go to Ely and see it. Nice to have you here today in the garden with Eli, and Kate is with us. Hello to Grandpa Gordy in Lethbridge, Alberta. Balmy minus 17 Fahrenheit. That is cold. Let's see, that's about minus 28, I think, Celsius. So definitely a cold day. We're going to have cold in lots of areas as we move forward. Gardens Happen, good to see you. Check out that video. Christy Grows' video was most recently about using permaculture in her allotment, and Gardens Happen is using digital microscope to look at cool stuff close. So I love that when gardeners start expanding beyond what they do on a day-to-day basis and experimenting with new ways and new items to add to the toolbox. So nice to have everybody here today. Scrolling down, Tennessee Nana says, the famous they are saying we're going to have 4-degree nights later this week. That is cold. 4 degrees is almost minus 16 degrees Celsius. My high temperature on Thursday is supposed to be 0 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 18. So yes, many of us are in for some cold, freezing conditions. And I'm not necessarily looking forward to that, but this is the time of year when some of that happens. Though I don't remember a December that's been this cold this early. And so I'm definitely keeping track of it. I'm glad I have my weather station so I can start looking at some of those things. Ultimate Gardening, nice to have you here. Starting veggie crops right now. Good for you. Yeah, it's not cold for all of us. There are some that can actually be doing some growing. Masabi Gal is at minus 10 degrees. And I agree with Gardens Happen. It is too cold for my blood. It's too cold for Mala's blood, too. She likes going outside and spending a lot of time in the garden and chasing rabbits and mice and whatever it happens to be. It's too cold for everybody in my neighborhood when it gets down to those kind of temperatures. So always lots of fun. Shandy's Garden later this week. Right now I'm trying to manicure my hands during the only time I really have beautiful fingernails. It's on after Christmas. Good for you. So nice to have you here, and so nice to spend this time during the holidays. I know some of you may be very busy as the holidays are approaching, and it's always nice that you took a little bit of time out of your day and out of your week to join us on the Gardener Scott channel. As the solstice approaches here for us, it's going to happen on Wednesday. In the winter, it signifies the shortest day of the year. And for those of you that are on the other side of the planet in the southern hemisphere, it's the longest day of the year. So while I think gardening is a year-round activity, it can become one of those hobbies, for some of us a passion, where each day just kind of runs into the next. And the calendar year works to schedule how we're going to garden and when we're going to start our planning. But I like to use the solstices as the anchor points in my garden. And I have a couple of videos on the winter solstice and a couple of videos on the summer solstice. And I found it interesting because I was doing a little bit of background research for the show today. And I came across a couple websites out there, gardeningetc.com and homesandgardens.com, and they referenced my summer solstice videos in some of their articles on the summer solstice in particular. And so I thought, well, let's talk the winter solstice, because might as well get as much word about Gardener Scott out there as we can. And I like this day. I've said this in videos before, that the winter solstice is one of my favorite gardening days. Now, throw away the side fact that it's extremely cold out there. I have snow on the ground and might even have some more snow coming. I'm not actively getting out into the garden and digging or planting, but this is the time of year that I really start getting excited about gardening because it's the shortest day of the year, which means the days are getting longer to the point that I can get the plants in the ground and I can start digging in the soil. And why I think it's important, aside from me personally looking at it as an anchor point in my garden planning, but it's also a point in the life of plants where things start to change, because particularly the perennial plants, the trees and the shrubs, the bushes, the perennial flowers, they're waiting for this day just like we are. And so they have a different way of looking at it. I look at it with my eyes and my brain when I start noticing the days are getting longer. It's these cells within the plant structure that basically do the same thing. They detect that the days are warmer, and they can actually detect that the days are getting longer. And that's why plants wake up in spring, because of the internal cellular clock that these plants have. Well, I love watching that happen. So if you've never really thought about it, think about it. Start observing your landscape, particularly your perennial gardens, on a daily basis. And you'll begin to notice how that trend develops and continues. When you are outside and the snow is melting, the days are warming, get into your plants and ruffle around a little bit around some of those dried leaves and dried grass blades. And at some point, maybe a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, but you'll start to see that new green growth developing. The plants are waking up. And it basically starts right now, because as the days get shorter, the plants start shutting down. Now it's the wake up time. So I just think this is such a wonderful day in our gardening calendar to take advantage of what we know happens to the plants, but we don't always observe it happening. So maybe add that to your list of to-do items this year and actually get down close to your plants. Become intimate with the growth of your plants and note the day that it happens. And do the same thing next year, and you begin to see the trends that your plants generally are all waking up in the same week every single year, because the days are getting longer, and that's what they're looking for as the weather warms up as well. So I think it's fun. Frank's asking, plants punch the clock? Yeah, basically they do. They're keeping track of the minutes in the day. I know, it's pretty crazy. Bowtie Life, nice to have you here today from Destin, Florida, where it's reached 50 degrees. That's a little bit cool. It's 10 degrees Celsius. My son in Louisiana is enjoying some cooler days this week as well. So kind of crazy. Mr. Tidy Garden, hello to you. Damien from Ireland, looking forward to the spring bulbs. Awesome. I hope you have some fantastic spring bulbs. I've mentioned this before. This year, for me, this last bulb season was the year without tulips. It was just such a crazy year that I love my spring bulbs as well. But we had some crazy, crazy cold temperatures at the wrong time in spring. So just as a lot of those plants were waking up, most of my spring bulbs were waking up, the frost hit so severely that basically all the blossoms were killed on the plant before they could open up. So keep your fingers crossed. I'm looking forward to a more beautiful year this year. There's always hope. We can encourage our plants, but they ultimately have to decide what they're going to do for themselves. And so other activities that I like to do on this day of the year, and so this holds true for the winter solstice and the summer solstice, is look at your shadow. we don't often think about that. We know that our plants need full sun, or if a shady plant, we know it doesn't need full sun. So we'll put our plants in their respective area, hopefully based on their sun needs. Particularly for new gardeners who are just getting into that mode of planning a garden, or maybe you're thinking about expanding your garden, you need to look at the shadows. You need to look at the sun in particular. And too many of us are planning our garden beds when it's sunny out. And we stand out on a nice hot summer day and look around and decide where we're going to expand our garden for the next year. Well, you have to anticipate the shade on the garden as well. And some of that shade is winter shade. So I've talked a little bit in the past, and I've mentioned this in videos as well, about microclimates. Well, start noticing today, in the summer, it's going to be your shadow being the shortest, and in winter, it's going to be the longest. And so you can actually stake out or measure, put stones to identify between the winter solstice and the summer solstice where the shadows play in your garden. And that could influence how you place your bed. So while I, like everyone else, stand out in my garden in the middle of summer to decide where I'm going to expand my garden, I do the same thing in winter, because I don't want to put a bed in a spot that gets full sun in summer, but maybe has limited sun in winter and spring and autumn, because this is where the microclimates come in. In my area, where the ground freezes solid in winter, it doesn't thaw out until it is exposed to full sun. And so as I look at the shadows on the winter solstice, I can get an idea of the areas that are going to warm up first. Because if it's in the sun in winter, then it's going to be in the sun during the summer. But if it's in the shade in the winter, then I need to track that shade, because there are some areas of my garden where the soil does not thaw well into April. And there's even some spots I've had that is pretty frosty, inches down in early May. Those are the kind of things you can start thinking about now. So observe the shadows. Observe what's happening in your garden, even if you can't actually get out there and do anything with it. Sunset Gazing spent Saturday winterizing outside faucets and sprinkler systems and washing blankets, expecting negative temperatures with wind chill. Should be interesting. So winterizing, that's another good aspect of activity. So I start my winter chores, so to speak, my gardening chores, again, using that anchor point of the winter solstice. So just today, I was out in the morning walking around like I often do. A little bit warmer today than it's going to be in the days ahead. But I started making note of those beds that I haven't cleaned up yet. I've already winterized my faucets because I need to. But I did note that some of the hoses I still have on the ground are pretty crunchy because there was some water in them and the water has frozen. Those are activities I start making a list of, because I know it's going to be warming up hopefully soon, and I'll need to drain those hoses and I'll need to start watering my plants. And so winterizing the faucets and the rest of your garden is great, but start thinking about that other aspect of it, is when you're going to start opening up the faucets to water your plants in spring or late winter, depending on how fast you warm up. Those are always things I like to look at. Sunset Farm, Ohio. Hello, happy Monday. A good winter project is taking inventory of my shade cloths, pest cloths, freeze cloths. Good idea. I like that idea. The process I use is with the hoops that I have over my beds. And so I pre-cut my shade cloth and pest cloth and hail cloth, and this is a great idea. There's not a lot happening in your garden right now, and it's all laid out and there's no plants getting in the way. And so take an inventory of what you have to cover your plants. And if you don't have those, go ahead and buy some bulk material and cut it to size. Now, when there's no plants to interrupt, you can lay the cloth right on your beds. If you use hoops, lay it over your hoops and then take inventory of it. Is it still usable? Most of these, depending on what you use as far as material, can last for years and years. So do they have rips? Do they need to be replaced? Can they be repaired? I love that idea. So that's a real good winter task to get out there and take care of some of those things. So thank you for suggesting that. Sherry's asking, do you recommend putting up a weather station at this time of year or wait until spring? So depends on what kind of weather station and how you're going to mount it. So if you watch the video that I did a few weeks ago, I actually buried mine in the ground to anchor it. I buried the pole and the post that supports the pole. Now, what I didn't show in the video is it took me almost an hour and a half to dig that hole that's 2 feet deep. Partly because my soil is just so compact, but also because it's frozen. So I would get my post hole digger out and I would pour water to thaw it out and soften it, and then dig out about an inch, maybe 2, pour more water, wait for it to soak in. And so while this time of year is an awesome time of year to think about putting a weather station in, because the weather is happening and you can actually see it and then measure it at the same time, do it. But if you're going to mount it with an in-ground hole, might take a little bit extra effort to dig that hole. So like most gardening activities, I just say do it when you think about it and when you have the time to do it. That's another thing about winter gardening, is we tend to have time to get out in the garden because we're not actively involved with the weeding and the pest control and the watering and the harvesting. But we still have that allocated time, gardening time, every day that we can devote to our garden. And a weather station could be a nice way to do it. Now, if you're going to mount a weather station to the side of a barn or to a tree or lots of other options you have, then sure, you're not limited by digging into the frozen ground. But regardless, yeah, I would consider it, Sherry. And that way you can start tracking some of those trends as the days are warming up and as you make note of the plants waking up. And that's one reason why I wanted to get my weather station in before winter hit, was so that I could start seeing that correlation. I've made note of it before, and I've tried to identify that first day I go out and see the new growth of my strawberries, and that first day that I see the rhubarb start to emerge from the ground, and of course the first day that I see the asparagus spears appear. Well, now I want to actually see if there's a correlation that I can measure between the lengthening days and the warming days, and when I first see the new growth of those perennial garden plants. So that's why I say, if you have an idea to put a weather station in, go ahead and do it now so you can take advantage of that bit of data as you're looking at some of these other aspects of your garden. So Sherry says, digging this week, the ground isn't frozen yet, so good for you. The anchoring of it is one of those things that is a more important aspect, and so how you decide to do that makes a big difference. Sunset Farm, Ohio, a weather station can track air temperatures and alert you of low air temperatures so you can protect delicate frost-sensitive plants, the last spring frost and the first autumn frost. Absolutely, absolutely, and you're exactly right. I've mentioned many times to look at the forecast, to be aware of the forecast, but the forecast from the National Weather Service or whoever you get your weather information from may not be a match for you and your garden. Mine is miles away, and I know that it's always a couple degrees off. And so if no frost is forecast, but I see the temperatures getting close to frosty conditions, I know I'm going to get a frost because my garden is a couple degrees off of the official forecast. But having that weather station, you can be very precise and get out there and cover up your plants and be ready for the cold that may not be forecasted by the official service. So absolutely great idea. Cheryl Hawker plans to make 4 sides and a top and screw them together. So if I want to take them off, I can unscrew them and store them in the shed. Also hoping with them we can put fleece in there too. So good for you. I'm looking at some of the other comments about what's going on. So nice to see that everyone's having some plans. Masabi Gal's talking about cattle panels collapsing in the storm. So all of those different things that we're using for support and anchors and the hoops and all of that, I'm glad to see that there's a lot of this information that's being passed back and forth. It's all really good information. So there you go. Bow tie life, as everyone's awesome. It gets them pumped up for the garden when I get in there. Unfortunately, I have to go to work now, painting and building outdoors today. Well, enjoy a good day at work and get back in the garden as soon as you can. So Lisa's wondering, can I recommend a good weather station to have in our yard? So check out that video that I did a couple weeks ago, because you can see the one I have, and what I found, I mentioned it in that video. For the most part, the basic design of weather stations tends to be very similar across the different companies, to the point that I would not be surprised if they're all not made in the same factory. And so a lot of it comes down to price and what factors you're looking for. So I mentioned that in the video, and you can decide which factors you want to choose in your weather station and then do a search. I got mine on Amazon. I have a link below, not to the weather station, but to Amazon. You can link through there. That helps support the channel. And then search to see if you find one that's in your price range and matches what you're looking for. I think it's important to have the wind and the temperature and the humidity, those kind of factors. But I chose one that also measures solar radiation, because of my skin cancer issues and wearing a hat and sunscreen all the time. I was interested in what kind of solar radiation is beating down on me in my garden. You don't necessarily have to get that in a weather station. So there's a lot of other factors. My recommendation would be identify what it is you want to measure and then find a weather station that matches that. Because as far as I could tell in my research, they're comparable. There really isn't anything out there that I came across that said, this is a terrible weather station. The reviews were all pretty much good. So it's just a question of how much you want to spend, and that makes a big difference. Jay's on top of things. There's my video on how to set up a home weather station. And so Jay and Heidi, our fantastic moderators, are on top of things so much. So nice to have you here. And hello to Creative Girl Homestead. Nice to have you as well. Thank you for joining us on the chat. Always nice to have so many people here. Let's see. One of the other things. Oh, I want to talk about this as well. Too often we correlate the solstices with the cold and the hot, but there isn't a direct correlation. The winter solstice is not the coldest day of the year, and the summer solstice is not the hottest day of the year. Coincidentally, it might be, because my overnight lows coming up on into Thursday, right after the official solstice day, are going to be at that level that define my hardiness zone. And so our hardiness zones are defined by our coldest average winter temperatures. And so I think we're going to get pretty close to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit here. That's about minus 27 Celsius. That's the determining factor for my zone 5B. The average coldest temperature is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. I may hit that this week. Normally, I don't hit that until the end of January or beginning of February. Coincidentally, it's happening around the solstice. So while it occasionally matches, that isn't one of those things that is typical. The same with the heat. In the June solstice, that's not the hottest time of year for me. The hottest time comes in August. So note those differences as you start using solstices to fit in with your garden planning. they may not necessarily correlate to winter and summer. It's just that's when those seasons start. And so that's why I like to use those as the anchor points in determining my scheduling of my garden activities. TJ the Hawk is wondering, are you planning to use your new greenhouse to your advantage this spring? Yeah, absolutely. And so my new greenhouse, and I'll be making more videos on it. There's not a lot happening in the greenhouse right now because it's just too cold. When it gets this cold, unless you have supplemental heat, it's too cold to grow anything. And I don't have supplemental heat in my greenhouse yet. But I'm planning, and you'll see videos on this, to use my greenhouse for the intermediate period. And so if Eli's still on with the In the Garden with Eli and Kate channel, she talks about some of this in her greenhouse videos, where it's a protected area. And so you can start growing plants, or you can put your plants in there in that protected area. For me, right now, it's without supplemental heat. They do use supplemental heat in their greenhouse. That's what I'll be doing. I'm planning to use my greenhouse as a place to harden off my seedlings a week or two earlier, because I'll be able to have the greenhouse in a little better condition. The night temperatures won't be as cold as if those plants that I'm hardening off are sitting out in the open. There's no wind, and it should enable me to get my plants in the ground a week or two earlier. So that's my big push for the greenhouse in this spring. I'm also hoping, and you'll see more on this as well, that I'm going to be growing a lot of peppers this year. I've mentioned that before, but I want to put some of those in the greenhouse early so that I have a nice long season. I want to grow some of those super hot peppers, and a lot of them take at least 120 days, which I don't have that much time in my outdoor garden to be guaranteed that the plants will do well. So yes, the spring in the greenhouse, I'm hoping to get a new and good early start this year. Hello to Tony from Simplified Gardening. Nice to see you here as well. And always good information. Always nice to have you here, Tony. Tony's been doing some live streams lately. And so I wasn't able to join you this last week, but I was there the week before. So start looking for some of Tony's live streams on the Simplified Gardening channel. Always good information there. And Tony's been doing a good job recently of interviewing others. Now, I had mentioned this a while back, and so Tony and I are often on the same brainwave pattern, because I've been setting up some guests for this show on Mondays in the new year. So that'll be something I'll be doing more of as well, where we have guest appearances of people, not just from YouTube, lots of other sources I'm looking into. And that's one of the nice things that Tony's doing as well. So check that out. Always good information there. And again, Jay's on top of things to highlight the wonderful book that Tony's done, Composting Masterclass. So thank you so much for that. So okay, let's see. I do have a list of some of the things that I wanted to talk about this solstice day. If the history of the solstice is effectively the history of agriculture, and you can also tie it to the history of many religions around the world, because the winter solstice in particular signified the rebirth of the sun. That's why I think it's so interesting if we as gardeners take this approach where we really start trying to observe the plants waking up in spring, and we make note with our weather stations of the lengthening days and the changing weather patterns. Civilizations have been doing this for thousands of years. They recognize that on the winter solstice, the days started getting longer. And so whether it was by erecting huge monuments or stones or even just simple mechanisms on the ground, there have been a lot of places and a lot of people from around the world that look at the winter solstice in particular as a very important time. And that ties in as well with why I think it's an anchor point in our gardening year. If they did it thousands of years ago, why shouldn't we do it as well and use this as a rebirth of our gardening energy and our garden planning for the year? So you can see I get a little excited about the winter solstice because I really do like this day. You know, it's the the cold of winter, it can be depressing, but the days are getting longer and the planting day is getting closer. And that's what I try to focus on at this time of year. It really does give me information. So, so let's see. The Brew Captain, Bohemian Herbology, is saying your Witch's Brew video is crazy cinematic. Did not expect that in a video. Great stuff. We're all growing hops now because of your inspiration. So interesting. So is the Brew Captain on? Let me scroll up and see if I can see where the Brew Captain said hello. So I'm guessing I just happen to have a connection with the Brew Captain. I don't actually see where the Brew Captain clicked on, but nice to have you here, Brew Captain. Nice channel. Of course, I watch every video of the Brew Captain. So nice to see you here. So I didn't see where you checked in, but check out the Brew Captain channel. It's not a gardening channel, though. There might be some changes in that direction, but growing your own hops and making your own beer, and there's lots of good fun stuff that you can see. Okay, let's see the planning aspect of the solstices. Now, I'm focusing on the winter solstice primarily because that's what's coming in a couple of days. But the summer solstice, I also like to think, I think of them as bookends. So the bookends of the gardening season, because the summer solstice is another one of those days. It's a happy gardening day because we get to be right about at the peak of our planting. All of our plants are usually in the ground for most of us by the summer solstice. And then we're just counting the days to the harvest period. And so I think planning on the solstices is something that you should just make a regular practice of. On the winter solstice, we're planting our spring garden. On the summer solstice, start thinking about your fall garden, especially as a new gardener. And I know some of you are new gardeners and you're picking up lots of information. When I started gardening, I just thought gardening was growing in June, July, and August. And that's all there was to it. I have since learned that I can grow in March and April and May. That's my spring garden. I can also grow in September and October and November. That's my autumn garden. And the key difference is that for many of us with our summer gardens, it's easy. You put a seed in the ground, you water it, and it grows because the sun's out and it's warm. Or you buy a transplant and stick it in the ground and water it and it grows. It takes more planning for a spring garden, and it takes more planning for an autumn garden because the days might not be giving you the warmth and the sun that the plants need. So there is that extra aspect to include protecting the plants with some of those fabric covers that we were just talking about. And so start now. Don't wait until spring to plan your spring garden. Go ahead and plan your spring garden as early as possible. And you've been busy, you've been buying gifts for the holidays, but stop and say, oh, hey, it's the solstice. This is the day that I actually sit down, get out my paper and pencil, get my iPad, get on my computer, whatever it is, and start doing the planning for the spring garden that you're going to be growing this year. And the same in the month that correlates with your summer solstice. Sit down and make that plan for what you're going to be doing in your autumn garden. And before you know it, even for me, in a short growing season, being the summer growing season, I still have other months that I can do things, like in my greenhouse. I say that this is what I'm planning to do in my greenhouse, but I actually have not gotten my written down plan together yet so that I know the day I'm going to start doing my hardening off and what I need to do in my greenhouse to make that happen. That's a key difference as to how you approach your schedule and your planning within your garden. I know I want to do that in my greenhouse, but when am I going to do it in my greenhouse? It all starts this week. I need to build some tables in my greenhouse. I need to add some insulation. I need to do a few other things. this is a great time of year when there's not a lot of other outdoor activities going on that I can sit down and actually put that schedule together. And that's what I encourage you to do as well. Tanya's townhouse garden. Can I use a tote as a cold frame? If so, do I put seedlings in there or larger plants? I want to try, but I'm rather confused how to start. Does box and lid need to be clear? So yes, you can use a tote. And so the tote that I think you're probably talking about is a square tote, and it has the folding lid on top. And I use totes to store Christmas decorations and a lot of other things. But yes, you can use it as a cold frame. In fact, actually, that's not a bad idea. There's a couple ways you can approach this. So I like, and I actually have a lot of footage on building a cold frame. I've just never put the video together. Maybe you'll see a video this year on putting cold frames in your garden. So there's a couple ways you can approach a cold frame. You can either use the cold frame to protect the plants that are actively growing in that spot on the ground. So if you have a spot in your garden that is tote size and you want to get an early start with the plants that are going to be growing in that spot, then cut out the bottom of that tote box, place it on that spot, leave it there for a few days. It'll warm up the soil, and then you can plant in that spot. And the tote acts like a little mini greenhouse. And yes, it should be clear plastic to allow the sun and the heat in. During the day, the lid is usually open because that heat can build up pretty dramatically. But then as the sun goes down, you close the top of the tote box that holds the warmth in, and that little spot is a microclimate that enables the plants in that area to grow earlier and to get a better start. The other option is to, especially in a tote, is to fill it with soil, and this might be what you're thinking, and start plants in it. Same idea. Have it open during the day, close it at night. It gets the sun. The plants are growing with all of the daylight, light and heat, and it gives you an opportunity to grow plants outside if you don't have inside growing space to get an early start. And then you would just dig them out and transplant them into another area. If you do that, make sure you drill holes in the bottom of it because you need to water, and you don't want the water to pool up, because especially if you're talking about a plastic tote, every time you water it, that water's going to stay inside. Before you know it, you're going to have a swimming pool that those plants are going to be growing in. So do drill holes in it, and that should help out. But a couple ideas, depends on which approach you want to do. The lid itself doesn't necessarily need to be clear because the lid is open during the day. So a clear sided box I think is better to allow the sun to reach the plants. If you can find one with a clear lid, that's great. But the purpose of the lid is just to hold in the heat during the day. Now on really cold days, you don't want to open the lid. You want to retain that heat. And that's where a clear lid would have a little bit better advantage, probably because the sun would still shine through into any plants that are growing. But I like that idea. A nice way to reuse maybe a tote that you have. Most cold frames tend to be wood sides and then glass on top or plexiglass. Just some clear material is usually what's on top of it. But I don't see why you couldn't use a tote that didn't have a clear top if that was the only one that you can find. So try it. Get out there, experiment a little bit with it, and see what you can discover about growing in a tote. I think that can be a fun experiment and decide how you want to grow. Shandy's Garden says you can take a potting soil bag, cut a square out, take some soil away, poke holes, and flip a clear tote on top. And that's a great idea. I didn't know Jessica had done a video about that. Roots on Refuge Farm is another good YouTube channel. So that's an interesting idea as well, is instead of growing in the tote, you use the tote upside down and use it as basically just a plastic cover over your plants that are growing in a soil bag. Interesting idea. I'll have to check out that video. I haven't done that before, but I like the idea. Urban Chicken Mama, first time growing lettuce under grow lights this year. They're doing very well. Have a marigold blooming in the Aero Garden and made pesto yesterday from Aero Garden basil and greenhouse kale. Delish. Nice. I'm going to be doing more and more. I haven't done as much indoor growing as I had planned because I'll be visiting some family at the end of the month for a few days and didn't want to have my plants die. But I'll be jumping into that in the beginning of January, and you all, of course, will see the progress. So I'm glad to hear you're having success with that, because that's exactly what I'm planning on doing, is doing lettuce indoors and lots of herbs. And then, of course, getting my peppers started pretty early. And so Cheryl's wondering about when to start onion seeds in the UK. Any help? And so those of you in the UK can definitely throw out when you start your onion seeds. And I have a video. I think I did a video last year about when to start your onion seeds. And if I do, I'm sure Jay's going to find it. And a lot of it depends on the type of onion. Now, I'm guessing in the UK that you are probably growing the long day varieties of onion, or possibly the intermediate day onions. But you can probably be starting pretty soon. I was starting, for me, here in a latitude that's a little bit farther south than you. I was starting my onion seed in January and February, 4 starts, and then I moved those starts outside. In fact, just this weekend, I enjoyed some wonderful pickled onions from the onions that I grew in my garden. I love pickled onions. And so I'm still using the onions that I harvested. And I started those from seed back in, it might have been the first week of February, and then put the starts out into the garden. If you're putting the seeds directly into the garden, now's a good time to do that. You can do that during the middle of winter. Go ahead and sprinkle your seeds on your beds. And this plays into that observation and the way that the cells work within the plants. It's the same way with the seeds. Go ahead and sow your onion seeds in your garden right now, wherever you are. And when the soil warms up and when the air temperature warms up for those seeds to germinate and grow, they will. And so I'm also doing that this year as well. I've sprinkled onion seeds on the bed, actually where I grew my onions last year, just in a different section. And I'm going to let them sprout. The most success I've had with onions in the past were when I grew onions, let them stay in the ground over the winter. They flowered and set seed, and those seeds fell on the ground, and then I allowed those seeds to just stay in place. And the next year, after those seeds were on the ground, they germinated much earlier in spring than I would have put a start out. And the growth of those onions was better than anything that I had artificially done by starting indoors and then transplanting. So a couple different options. In both cases, you can probably be starting pretty soon, especially in the UK, because I'm guessing that you can put your onion starts in the ground a little bit earlier than some of the rest of us. And it doesn't hurt, a bigger start can give you a nice big plant that starts growing a little bit earlier. So go for it. Nice to see you today, Gilles. I hope that's how you pronounce your name, I'm guessing. When you make your garden covers, i.e. frost covers, what do you use? Could I use polypropylene interfacing from the fabric store, or you can purchase it by the yard? Oh, absolutely. You can use anything. And polypropylene is one of those materials that should be able to last for multiple seasons. And so muslin, for instance, is a fabric that you can get at a fabric store very cheaply. Muslin can be a great fabric to use as a cover. And so saving money by buying fabric by the yard, especially if you can find it on sale at the fabric store, you could use virtually anything. The key point to be aware of is why you're using it. And so for something like muslin or polypropylene, are you putting it over your plants to keep pests out? And so those are the kind of covers that are really good in the springtime, where you might have insect pests that would want to eat your little seedlings as they emerge. Well, row cover fabric is essentially a polypropylene fabric that many places will sell. And you just cover your hoops completely so no insects can get in to eat your plants. And then once your plants get bigger, you can remove the cover for insects to come in to pollinate your plants. Or are you covering your plants because you want heat to remain in that particular bed? That's when I use plastic, just sheets of painter's plastic, and cover the bed, allow it to warm up during the day. The plastic holds that heat in at night, and it helps keep my early spring garden warm. You can also do all kinds of netting to keep pests out. So it all depends on why you're covering your plants. That will determine what material you use. But interfacing can actually should allow you to have the sunlight enter, and it should serve the purpose of holding some of that heat in, and it can also keep some of those spring pests away. And so my wife has done a lot of quilting and blanket making in the past, and I'm just trying to base this on the interfacing that she has used for some of her projects. And I never thought about using it in the garden, but yeah, it should be a suitable material depending on how much you can get and how big your hoops are, and again, the intent that you're doing it. So it's one of those experiment things. Go ahead and try it and see what you think. The sun, when it does start warming up and it does get into those really hot days, can cause some crazy damage on those materials, those plastic-based materials. So they might only last a couple seasons. Just be aware that you might need to replace it at some point. A lot of the stuff I use, I like to get at least 2 seasons out of it. And the hailcloth, for instance, I'm going on my 3rd season, I think, for some of those. So if you can get a material that is nice and sturdy and reusable, that's one of those things that I would encourage you try to approach from that perspective as well. So, okay, let's see. I know I'm running behind, so I'm going to try to scroll down and catch up to make sure that I'm not too far behind what the comments are. Yeah, Shandy's Garden uses Thule in the garden because it's a real fine mesh and super cheap. Yeah, same basic idea. And yeah, I could see how Thule would be a nice material to use in the garden as well. So thanks for that. Jay says, I discovered many grades, thicknesses of row covers and greenhouse plastic. The price tripled last year. Yeah, that's not surprising. It's hard to hear that. I've noticed a lot of that as well. Another reason why, if you can reuse it, take advantage of something. If you can get it when it's on sale and then reuse it for years to come, it's one of those things that you definitely get your money's worth out of it. So thanks for that. So, okay, let's see. It looks like Rob's allotment channel is here. Nice to have you here as well. Always so nice. Let's see. Let me switch to my other screen to see. Yeah, we're over 200 people. Not bad for a holiday week, and lots of other people around that aren't thinking about gardening. That's why I wanted to talk about, the solstice. A lot of people don't even start thinking about gardening until the days are actively warming up. And so I like to get a jump on the season and start thinking about it before the days warm up so that I can be ahead of the game and know what's happening or what's coming in my garden. Joe's Crayons, good morning to you. I sometimes grow strawberries and mostly buy them to make strawberry milkshakes. There you go. I like that idea. I've been trying to figure out how to do a video. I've been making notes because that's what I want to make, a video on that idea of you grow something for a very specific purpose. And so I want to make this video with examples but also trying to figure out how to incorporate that basic idea and make it an interesting video. Because I do a lot of that as well, where I grow very specific plants for very specific purposes. Now, for me, I grow strawberries right next to my rhubarb to make strawberry rhubarb jelly. I love strawberry rhubarb jelly. And so that's one of the main reasons why I grow both strawberry and rhubarb. And I grow strawberries to make strawberry jam, and I make rhubarb, or grow rhubarb to make rhubarb jelly by itself. And so those are primary reasons why I grow those plants, in addition to the fact that you can just pluck a strawberry and eat it. So I love that idea, growing strawberries for the purpose of making strawberry milkshakes. Absolutely. And so start thinking about that with all of the things that you're growing. Why are you growing them? You should have a purpose. You should have a reason why you're growing all of your plants. It could be just because you want to experiment. It could be because it's nostalgic and somebody in your family grew it years ago and you want to repeat. But I think that one reason that particularly new gardeners often don't continue to become old gardeners is because they don't have that purpose. They don't really know why they're growing their plants. They go buy a bunch of seeds and plant them, and then they don't know what to do next. And the plant just does okay, and they harvest, and they don't know what to do with the harvest. I say begin with that outcome in mind. So yeah, you like strawberry milkshakes, then grow strawberries. And that runs across the board with everything. And it should match with what you like to eat and what you like to grow. And so regularly, I'll be at a restaurant or even at my own dining room table, and I'll eat something and think, I bet I could grow this in my garden and not have to buy it. And of course, that really influences my planning and my choice of plants in my garden. So I love that idea. I may actually repeat that in a future video about growing strawberries for strawberry milkshakes. I think that's wonderful. Francis, I'm just about to set up my grow room. I have lights, mats, etc. What should the room temperature stay at approximately, or do the lights and mat generate enough heat? So it depends on the lights, it depends on the mat, and it depends on how warm your household temperature is. Now for me, I keep my house relatively cool in the winter. And so in my grow room area, it tends to be about 65 to 66 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 18 to 18 and a half Celsius. And that's the air temperature in that room. The mat, depending on the mat, should raise the temperature at least 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And so ideally, the plants, most of the seedlings we're growing, are in that 68 to 70 degree Fahrenheit range, somewhere around 20 degrees Celsius. But it's okay if it's cooler, and it's okay if it's warmer. That's where the heat mat comes in. The heat mat is not going to be warming the air, it's just warming the soil, because the seeds will need a warm soil to germinate. And warm is relative. Some, like peppers in particular, will germinate better in a warmer soil. So most of the seeds I start, I do not put on a seed mat. And so though my grow room might be at 66 degrees Fahrenheit, the seeds germinate just fine, the seedlings grow just fine, it's just a little bit cool. But for those plants that benefit from a warm soil, eggplant in addition to the peppers, and even tomatoes. Tomatoes can germinate a little bit cooler, but I usually put them on a heat mat as well. They're germinating with a soil temperature that is 5 degrees Fahrenheit, or maybe even 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. That just hastens the germination. And so I wouldn't be so concerned about the air temperature in your grow room unless it's much colder than that, in which case you might want to put in some room heaters to crank up the heat a little bit. Let the plants grow. They will naturally grow in a pretty wide range of temperatures, air temperatures. they'll germinate in a pretty wide range of soil temperatures. They'll just do better in a warmer temperature. So if you have the mats, definitely use them. I think I saw Mala walk in the background. So she's been outside and is joining me now. So, oh, she's nice and warm. So it must be sunny out there and warming up. So I hope that helps out, Francis. Go ahead and check your lights, because the one thing about the lights is the type of lights you're using. So I have both fluorescent lights and LED lights, both of which generate some heat, not as much heat as an incandescent bulb. But when you place your lights, the lights should be pretty close to the plants. We're talking just a few inches above the plants. And so that little bit of heat that the lights are producing is often enough to raise the air temperature around the plants as well. And so that's why I don't worry too much about the room temperature. With the mat heating the soil and with those lights warming up the air just a few degrees, my plants do great every year. And of course, I've got videos that show my plants growing, and I really don't worry much about the temperature in the room itself. Everything works out fine. So go ahead and monitor that, Francis, and make note of it. One of the things I'm actually planning to do a video on heat mats here in just a couple weeks. And so I've started setting up the area. I'll be starting some pepper seeds. And what I'm planning to do for that video is to actually measure the soil temperature, to use a thermometer, and note the difference between the grow areas that aren't heated with a mat and the grow areas that are heated with a mat. Make note of the temperature, and then also make note of how quickly the seeds germinate. And there will be a difference. That's what I'll show in the video. But ultimately, once the plants start growing, you usually take them off of the heat mat, and they grow fine in whatever ambient air temperature you happen to have. Tennessee Nana, I'm going to make some seed tape like you showed in a video. Now I'm stockpiling torn paper for composting. Good for you. Yeah, that seed tape is a lot of fun. I did that video, I think that's a 4-year-old video, maybe a 5-year-old video by now, where my granddaughters and I made some seed tape. So that's a fun project. I'm glad you're doing that, because not only is it a fun project, but it's actually a very effective way to lay out your seeds so that the germination of the seeds matches where you want the plant to be growing, rather than having to just sprinkle seeds and then go back and thin later on. So good for you. That should be a nice fun project. So, okay, let's see. I'm scrolling again. There's Tony. I think folks will hold back a little this year. I'm just leaving to drive to work. We'll continue to listen, but can't comment until I get there. So thanks for joining in today, Tony. And always nice to have you involved with the conversation. So Francis is also saying thank you, and a bi-level and lower level is very cool. We'll adjust accordingly and let you know. So good. And yeah, we'll be talking, moving into the new year, we'll be talking a lot more about seeds and seedlings, and of course I'll have more videos on all of that, and I'll try to incorporate the discussion of temperatures more because we're talking about it today, but I'd definitely like to see the feedback from everybody. Urban Chicken Mom, and my thrift store white sheets do double duty, Halloween ghost and garden shade cloth. That's a really good idea. And so yeah, some of the best shade cloth I've used is old tarps and old sheets. I've used old sheets. I've used old shower curtains. So a lot of times, like we were talking about before, it really doesn't matter what the material is as long as it matches the purpose of why you're using it. So yeah, thrift store sheets as shade cloth, go for it. A nice cheap way to get some shade cloth, because shade cloth can add up into your budget if you want to buy shade cloth that is designed as shade cloth, when you can definitely find some alternatives that may work just as good, if not better. So while I'm thinking about it and we're talking about gardens, let's go ahead and talk about the background today. This comes from Suzanne Griggs. I had asked you all to send some pictures of your gardens in winter, and by all means, send more. If you've got a garden in winter, go ahead and send it to me, gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. But this is wonderful. We've actually seen this garden in the past from a different perspective, but I like this. This is similar to the picture I showed last week of my garden, with the beds just laid out in a nice row, all cleaned up, nice and clean, waiting for spring with that nice snow cover on them. Now, I wanted to point out this really nice rock border. You can see that it's elevated right here. It looks like maybe 3 levels of these stones. And so that means over here, really can't see it in this picture, but it's a raised bed. I was on Tony's live stream a few weeks back where we were talking about raised beds, and the idea being that a raised bed is simply a bed that it rises above the level of the ground. It doesn't have to be wood. These are all beautiful wood raised beds, but it could be as simple as just a few layers of stone that raises your planting area above the regular level of the garden. So I like that idea where you can actually border a pathway, a long pathway, and create that whole space on the other side of the path as a raised bed. So I like that idea, Suzanne. Thank you for allowing me to show that. And then back here, you can see the compost pile. It's got snow on it, but it's got materials stacked in front of it. That's what my compost pile looks like right now. I've got materials stacked in front, and of course there's snow on top of it. So a nice setup. You can also see some separate beds that are laid out in the background here. And so just a nice garden space. Even in winter, you can get out, you can enjoy your garden, you can enjoy the freshness and the cleanness of your garden space, and also get the ideas like I was talking about with the shade. And so I have a shed like this as well that I've shown in some of my videos. So I'm not sure what's on the other side of this shed, but you can see as I observe the shadows back here, you can see the shadows in the snow. That's telling me that the sun is on this side of the screen, and north is probably on this other side where the shed is. So on the other side of this shed, it's probably in shade all winter long. And so assuming you wanted to grow plants on the other side of your shed, start making note of the shade that's happening around the winter solstice, and that might help identify when you want to put in like some of these other beds that surround a shed. The shade's definitely going to be a factor in what plants you can grow in that space. So yeah, send me your winter pictures, because I think a garden looks good at any time of year. I try to garden for 4-season interest, and I like the look of this garden. These beds look like they're a little bit longer. You can see how they have butt joints. They have 2 boards that are butted together, and you can see how they used an extra board to help anchor the 2 pieces together. So I'm guessing these beds are probably 14 to 16 feet long. A lot of garden space, and then you can see the pathways in between to allow access to all 4 sides. So some really good bed design in a nice clean garden like this. So hopefully that gave you a few ideas and maybe something that you can use for the future. So thank you for sharing that picture. Sunset Farm, Ohio. Can I refreeze seeds that have thawed? Putting packs for stratification in the fridge, but not using them all back in the fridge. Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily refreeze seeds. You could definitely put them back in the refrigerator, and I do that all the time. I have seeds in the refrigerator. I showed this in a couple of videos earlier this year where I was stratifying. I've got a video on stratification and scarification. And I have the seeds in the refrigerator. I bring them out. I put them in the pots to germinate, and the ones I don't use, I put back in the refrigerator. The reason I say don't refreeze because freezing and thawing can damage seeds, depending on the seed. Some seeds actually need that, but most of the seeds that we're growing don't benefit from a freeze-thaw cycle. So if you had seeds in the freezer and then they thawed, if you put them back in the freezer for another freeze-thaw cycle, that could damage the seeds and it might affect the viability and the germination of that seed. So the refrigerator is fine. In and out of the refrigerator is really no big deal. It's no different than warm days and cold days in spring. But I would caution against freezing and refreezing of the seeds, just because the cells could burst within the seed, and that's what causes the damage, is the freezing and the thawing of it. So keep that in mind as well. So Sunset Gazing is wondering if the other side of this shed is glassed in. I'm guessing that it isn't. And so the reason I say that is because for my greenhouse, for instance, I'm going to be putting insulation on the north side. So here in the northern hemisphere, the sun's coming from the south. There's no sun on the north. And so you don't need to have a clear north side to your shed or to your greenhouse. And you can use that side for hooks, for tool storage, for extra insulation, for the water barrels to help keep that space nice and warm. It doesn't need to be clear. So while this side is clear to allow sun in, and I'm guessing that they're doing some growing in there, I'm also guessing that north side is solid and is probably allowing for some storage or extra insulation. But that's a good question. We often see greenhouses and polytunnels that are clear on all sides, but you really don't need to have it clear on the side that's away from the sun. And that allows you to use that space in a different way. You could put reflective material up there. That's the way that the greenhouse was at the Galileo Garden, that big 42-foot dome greenhouse. That north side, about a third of the greenhouse on that north side was not the polycarbonate panels. It was polycarbonate panels. That's just the way that the structure was designed, but it was all covered with reflective material, reflective insulation, so that the sun coming in the south side would reflect off of that foil material on the north side. So that helps spread the light around and helps spread the heat around, and that's a good way to use that side that never sees the light. So something to make it a little bit easier when you're designing and planning to use a greenhouse or a polytunnel, is to recognize that one side can be used for other purposes, the side that's away from the sun. Stephen Hope started a lasagna compost bed and have many for mulch later in spring. Watched your leaf mold vid yesterday. Thanks for that, Gardener Scott. You're welcome. And so I have a new project. I'm not going to say much about it because I don't know if it's going to work, but it's in the same concept as the leaf mold, and I'll be starting on that here pretty soon. But I'm guessing that video is a year to a year and a half out, depending on how that project works out. But I'm going to be trying something new that I've never seen before, and I'll share it with you maybe in a few months as we get started with that. But that basic idea of lasagna composting and leaf mold, use the materials you have, especially at this time of year. And so another action item for you: if you bagged up your leaves and in fall, and now it's winter and you're not sure what to do with those bagged leaves, and if you have to wait till spring to use them, you can go ahead and start a leaf mold pile in snow. Go ahead and choose where you're going to put your leaf mold and start dumping your bags of leaves. Not a lot's going to happen if you live in a very cold area and the ground's covered with snow, but at least it's there and it's ready. And just like the plants wake up in spring and start growing, well, the same happens with the bacteria that's in the soil and the fungi that's in the soil. And that's what's going to cause your leaves to break down and become leaf mold. And so go ahead and get a jump on the season. put them in place now when it's too cold for any of those microbes to be actively decomposing. But as soon as it starts warming up, they're going to get to work. They're going to be active. And while we may think it's too cold to get outside and garden, oh man, the life in our soil is extremely active, even at very low temperatures. And so you can start putting together your compost pile using a lasagna method or your leaf mold in the middle of winter. Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. So I'm glad to hear that you're doing that because again, too many of us think gardening activities have to take place in the warm weather of the growing season. And there's so much we can do outside that main growing time to actively be involved with our garden and recognize how nature works and all of those organisms that are working to our benefit. Let them do that on their schedule as the sun warms and as the days get longer. We tried to pack everything we do with gardening to fit our schedule, and it doesn't always work that way for the best results. So work with nature. Yeah, get out there and do some stuff. Shandy's garden, I've used cardboard strips that I've kept wet and anchored with bricks. I've just literally tried everything. I've seen people use pegboard to space out the seeds, then just shift it over. Brilliant. So we're talking about the seed tape ideas. You can use bathroom paper, you can use paper towels, you can use newspaper, cardboard strips. Those are all great ideas. Anything that'll break down in the soil and give the seed something that it can grow onto. Trans women are sexiest men. Welcome to the channel. I'm in a cold climate and was surprised at the heat from rapid decomposition in my compressed leaf mold tower during winter. There you go. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Thank you for saying that, because that is exactly the idea. It is surprising. It's crazy surprising that there can be so much activity when we think everything has shut down. And so leaf mold is typically a fungal activity, and the fungi don't necessarily generate as much energy as the bacteria, but the bacteria, those thermophilic bacteria, get in and they start decomposing. That's what they do. They generate heat, and the heat they generate now makes it warm enough for the fungi to come in and continue to break down of the leaves or the cardboard or whatever we're using that is a wood-based product. So fantastic. Thank you for that feedback, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's crazy surprising. And that's why when I began the show today saying get out there and start observing what's happening in your garden as the days warm and get longer. It's those kind of things. And when you recognize that kind of activity, that you get that thermal variance just because of the microbes that are working, it's enough to blow your mind. So I appreciate that, especially for those of us in a cold environment. So Bud's saying, I would love you to do a video on composting in the winter. My very hot pile has gone to sleep with our freezing weather. And so, yeah, I don't think Tony has a specific video on winter composting. He does talk about in his book on composting some winter gardening or winter composting. And you're right, I don't have that as well. I've got a video on lazy composting because I don't do a lot of work, but I appreciate that idea, Bud, and actually I will add that to my list. Maybe I'll try to actually do a hot pile this next year and carry it into the winter. It takes work, and that's why I like lazy composting in the winter, where I allow my pile to freeze, because it takes work to keep a pile hot in the cold weather. It can, definitely. And I've had some people that have shared videos and photos with me in recent weeks in cold climates with the steam rising off of their piles. Can definitely be done. And you're right, that is a good suggestion for making a video. I just don't usually take that much effort, but maybe you've motivated to do that for this next winter. It's a little bit late for me right now because my pile is frozen and I don't have enough material to start a new pile. But that is one of those things that is beneficial if you're serious about composting to know how to do it in winter. Sunset from Ohio, should I cover the big leaf pile with plastic or cardboard for the winter, or does it matter? It does matter. So like we were just talking about, that the microbes will be more active when it's warm. If you don't cover your pile and you're in a cold area, and I'm guessing in Ohio you're probably in a cold area, and the pile will freeze, when it warms up again, then it'll get active again. And so the leaf pile will start breaking down and the microbes will be active as soon as it warms up. And this ties in with the idea of winter composting. If you can create a warm pile, covering it helps it stay warm. It's just like putting plastic over our hoops to keep our plants warm. By covering a leaf pile or covering a compost pile, you can help retain the heat to help keep it from freezing so that those microbes stay active much longer than they would if we just didn't. And cardboard achieves the same thing. Cardboard is actually a pretty good insulator until it gets wet and then begins to break down. So if you want to be active and try to maintain the heat in the pile, you can cover it with clear plastic during the day and use that clear plastic at night, and that'll help warm it and also help hold in the heat. Cardboard is actually going to act as a shade material during the day, so it's not going to generate any heat, but any heat that's generated, the cardboard will help keep it in. It just comes down to how fast you want that material to break down. If you want to make that effort to cover a leaf pile or a compost pile, then it will decompose faster. That's just the way it works. If you have the patience that I do and don't want to get out in the cold and work that hard, then it does make a difference. The pile's just going to freeze, and it doesn't matter if you cover it after it's frozen or not, the pile's still going to stay frozen. Covering a frozen pile just kind of helps hold that cold in and really doesn't achieve much. So it's up to you to decide if it's warm enough now and you want to retain that heat, or if you want to cover it with plastic to generate heat and then cover it, or just take the easy, lazy approach and wait for nature to warm it up naturally, and then accept the decomposition to happen as nature is deciding that it needs to be happening. So, Egypt Valley Homestead, hello to you. My peppers never get more than 8 inches high. Any tips? And so in most cases, so there's a couple things, but in most cases it comes down to the soil. And so the soil and how good the soil is a big factor in determining how big the plant is going to get. And when I talk about soil, I'm talking about all those microbes. I'm talking about the nutrition in the soil. I'm talking about the tilth of the soil. How loose is it, or how compacted is it? And so if you transplant into a compacted soil that doesn't have a lot of nutrients, then the roots aren't going to be in a happy environment, and they're not going to grow very big, and they're not going to produce a big plant. If you put a small plant into loose soil that's loaded with nutrients, you're going to get a big plant. That's generally how it works. Now, the other piece to it is the shade and the sun as well. You can have perfect soil, but if your pepper plants are not getting at least 8 hours a day, 6 is the absolute minimum, but 8 hours of direct sunlight a day, then the plants aren't going to grow that big. I saw that this year in different areas that I grew the peppers. The peppers that I grew in my oldest bed, the one that I put in first 3 years ago, it has the richest soil, it has the loosest soil, and it's in absolute full sun more than any of the other beds in my garden. The peppers I grew in that bed were almost 3 feet tall. I've never grown peppers that tall before, because I've never had bed conditions that were that good before. Another area of my garden also gets full sun, but the soil was only 1 year old. It's my newest bed. So the soil life wasn't as active, the nutrient levels were not as high, and those pepper plants only got about 12 to 15 inches high. And so in your case, with small peppers to start with, I would say it's soil and sun that are the most likely culprits. The other thing to be aware of, if you're starting your peppers from seed, don't keep them in a small pot. I've seen this with a lot of gardeners as well. You start your seed in like a small 3-inch pot. The plant grows and you keep the plant in that 3-inch pot for the 3 or 4 months that it's growing indoors. Now when you put it outside, well, the plant has been stunted from its earliest days, and it often will stay stunted and not grow much bigger than that. So if you're growing your peppers from seed indoors, be aware that at some point you should probably up pot them, put them into a bigger pot so that you'll get that root development. The more roots you have, the bigger the plant's going to be. So you need to figure out a way to get more roots, and that's through the soil and the nutrients in the soil. And so in whatever bed you're growing them in, make sure you've got lots of compost, lots of other organic matter. Another big issue, and I see that here in my area where it's very dry and very hot in the summer, the soil needs to stay evenly moist. And so if you're allowing your soil to dry out, what that effectively does is all those new roots that are developing on your pepper plants, they're looking for that nice happy soil that's moist. The soil dries out, those roots die. Now the plant has to send out more roots. And if the soil dries out, those roots die. And so what happens is a stunted plant. Plant is putting all of its energy into root development, and then the roots die because the soil dries out because you're not watering enough. And you could also achieve the same thing if you water too much. You're drowning the roots. So consistently moist soil, full sun, and a nutrient-rich soil, and hopefully those tips should enable you to have some bigger peppers to grow in the future. Okay, let's see. Sunset gazing, spotted a good deal of leaves on a cul-de-sac island. Excited to collect them the next day. We had torrential rains and the leaves all washed away. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I would be bummed too because I haven't had a lot of fallen leaves, and sorry to hear that they washed away. That is a sad story. So lesson learned. Do the same thing next year. Just try to figure out how to keep them from washing away. Maybe put them in a bed with edges to it and then put the leaves inside so they can't wash away. But collecting the leaves is a nice option if you can find something along those lines. So Dusty Flat says, all depends on climate and microclimates on where to place the plants. Absolutely. And yeah, that's why I was talking about the shade earlier. And I've got some videos where I talk about microclimates and the climates, of course. But you're exactly right. It's the right plant in the right spot, period. And the plant is looking for the nutrition and the sun and the water. And as long as you can provide what that plant needs, the spot is the right spot. If the soil is bad, if it doesn't get enough light, if it gets too much light, if it's a shade-loving plant, if it gets too much water, not enough water, all those are factors that will make the plants not do well. So the right spot, the right location for the plant is critical. And then how you then take the steps that you have control over, like the nutrition of the soil and the watering of the soil, you'll have wonderful plants. It sounds simple, but it is one of those things that does take time. That's why gardeners are always struggling to have success, because it sounds simple, but it isn't always as simple as it sounds. So that's funny that we talk about, yeah, all you got to do is just put it in the right spot with the right amount of sun and the right amount of water, and things will be great. But of course, the experience makes a lot of difference as well. Cheryl says, I've started a worm farm for all my kitchen scraps and peelings, as we got red ants in the composter last time I put food in it, so don't do that now. Gonna get lots of worm castings. Good for you. And one of the nice things about, especially if you get serious about the worm farms, is it usually takes about 3 months, depends on the type of worm. But if you keep your worms happy, they'll double within 3 months. And then you keep them happy and they'll double again in 3 months. So you can start with a pretty small worm farm, and before you know it, you got a whole bunch of worms, and they're generating a whole bunch of castings. And I'm using more castings this year than I've ever used before because I got more worms than I've ever had before, and it's a great addition to your potting mixes. And so last year I talked a little bit in my potting mix video and showed a little bit about adding the worm castings. This year I'm going to be adding a lot more worm castings to my potting mixes that I'll be growing my seedlings in because I have more worm castings to use. So what can be better than that? Let's see. Cheesecake. My husband got a lot of leaves from our neighbors, friends, church yards. He put them in 2 piles using chicken wire and a new bed mixed with compost, coffee grounds, topsoil as a trial. Great trial. And yeah, chicken wire is a great idea to help hold it all in so it doesn't wash away. And that's what I did with my leaf mold, as I showed in that video that I saw Jay linked to. Great trial. I'm glad that you're trying that because it takes time. The addition of the compost and the coffee grounds and the soil should actually accelerate the process a little bit, but it takes at least a year for those leaves to break down into a form that they're usable. And that's actually one of those things I'll be using this year as well in my potting mixes is I'll be adding some of that leaf mold. So this year I'm looking forward. I think my potting mixes are going to be the best ever because I'll be adding my homemade leaf mold and my homemade worm castings and really making it into something that I can benefit from. The one of the things I'm going to be trying, I'm not ready to make a video on it yet, but I got a pomegranate tree from IV Organics, and I'm going to be growing that pomegranate tree in a pot. My winters are way too cold to grow pomegranates, but the soil blend that I'll be using in that pot will include the leaf mold and the worm castings, in addition to a lot of the other materials that I normally use in a potting mix. So you'll probably see a video at some point, assuming I can keep the pomegranate tree alive and growing in a pot. I'll be talking about the soil blend I use. That's why I recommend doing those kind of things like leaf mold, because you can use it in a number of different ways to benefit the soil and to create that environment that allows the plants to grow well and grow as big as possible. So I'm so glad to see some of you are getting into that. And if you haven't done it yet, go for it because it is so easy to do. It takes time. You have to have patience, but nature does all the work, and then you just reap the benefits in the end. So this is my last show before we get to the big holidays, Christmas in particular, this upcoming weekend. I will be here next week. I mentioned that last week. So I will be here next Monday. But between now and next Monday, I want to wish you the best of the holiday season. And so if you celebrate the holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Festivus, whatever it happens to be. Happy Kwanzaa after that. Enjoy the holiday season. If you don't celebrate a particular holiday, well, then use this time as the gardening spirit to be part of your day. And I like to think of the holiday spirit and the gardening spirit as essentially the same. I talk all the time as to how wonderful I think gardeners are and how we have something in us where we want to give to others. We have the patience in our lives. We're trying to learn. We're trying to grow. We're trying to benefit our own yard. We're trying to benefit the planet. And that plays in so well with what the holiday season is all about. Those same positive thoughts, the same sharing, the same patience, the same mentality of trying to benefit those around us and to benefit the world. And so while it may be a particular date on the calendar that we recognize, regardless of whatever the holiday is, we're still gardeners at heart. And as we proceed beyond the holiday season, carry forward, as we move into the new year, carry forward that gardening mindset, that happy holiday mindset. And as you're hopefully enjoying this time and maybe spending it with friends and family, share gardening. When you're sitting around and sharing the gifts, I hope some of those gifts might be gardening related, either the ones you receive or the ones you give. And when you're sitting around the table and sharing food and drink, share stories of gardening. Share what it is you like about your garden that you want others to know about. Because that not only helps us feel good because we can talk about what makes us happy, but the more and more you do it, the more and more you might recognize that others enjoy it as well. I had some friends that came to visit this last weekend, and two young women in particular. They recently turned 21, twins. I haven't seen them in months because they've been away at school, they've been overseas, and their parents and the two of them came to visit. The first thing they asked me was what my next Gardener Scott video was going to be, because that's just one of the topics we talk about is gardening and Gardener Scott videos. And I haven't seen them in months, and they wanted to know about my Gardener Scott channel and what videos I was doing. It warmed my heart to recognize that these young, fabulous, incredible women were interested in what I wanted to do and what I was interested in talking about. Of course, I immediately turned the conversation back to them and their travels and their studies, but it was one of those underlying themes throughout the day as we talked about gardens and their mother's garden and gardening in general, and just how good it makes us feel in that type of social situation. So use it to your advantage and share the stories and ask others that might be gardeners as well about their gardens, and just be in the best holiday spirit that you can be until we get back together again next Monday. And I do hope to see you here then when we have another fabulous chat. Have a wonderful week. I hope you stay warm if the cold is coming. I hope you stay safe, and I hope you stay happy. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.